In this session, we will discuss about the ascending tracts. Before going to study about ascending tracts, let me tell you very briefly about the spinal cord. I am not going in detail. I am taking the total central nervous system. This is the cerebrum. This is midbrain. Next to the midbrain, dilated part, pons. Next to the pons, cone-shaped or bulb-shaped part, medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata from the lower part of the foramen magnum, otherwise from the upper part of the first cervical vertebra, it is continuing down as spinal cord. So this is spinal cord. The spinal cord extends up to the level of lower border of L1 and terminates as cone-shaped structure. This cone-shaped structure, what you call conus medullaris. So from here to here, this is spinal cord. Of course, the tip of the cone-shaped structure shows one pyometer extension. This pyometer extension, what we call phylum terminal. Then spinal cord shows two dilatations. In the cervical region, one dilatation. In the lumbar region, another dilatation. So let me show you that dilatations. In the cervical region, this is the dilatation, and in the lumbar region, there will be one more dilatation. See, from here to here, this is spinal cord. In the cervical region, it shows dilatation. This dilatation, what we call cervical enlargement. In the lumbar region, it shows one more dilatation. This dilatation, what we call lumbar enlargement. Why? Because in case of thoracic region, spinal cord is narrow because less number of neurons are present, because it has to supply only to the body wall. But if you observe in the cervical region, it has to supply to the body wall and it has to supply to the upper limbs. Then in case of lower part, this spinal cord has to supply to the body wall and also to the lower limbs. That's what more neurons are needed and the more neurons are accumulated over here. Because of that, here one enlargement and here one more enlargement. This enlargement what we call cervical enlargement and this enlargement what we call lumbar enlargement. Then from the conus medullaris, so many nerves will be attached and it appears like tail of horse, otherwise horse tail. This structure what we call cauda equina. What is the structure called? Cauda equina. If you see the spinal cord from the anterior view, you can see one fissure. This fissure what we call anterior median fissure. Of course, this anterior median fissure will be extending into the medulla also as same name. Lateral to the anterior median fissure, you can see one more sulcus. This sulcus what we call anterior lateral sulcus. Then if you observe posteriorly, same structures will be there, but the names are different, because in the anterior aspect it is like a more depressed part. Because of that we are calling as anterior median fissure. But in case of posterior part, it is not extending very deep. Because of that only it is looking like sulcus. So posteriorly, posterior median sulcus, I am drawing dotted lines, and on either side same name, posterior lateral sulcus. Now when you take the section of spinal cord, how it will be looking like, we will discuss here, because we need to know where grey matter is located, where white matter is located, where tracts are ascending and tracts are descending. Because of that we need to know the transverse section of spinal cord. Let me draw that. In the posterior part, posterior median sulcus. This sulcus what we call posterior median sulcus. Then here one more sulcus is there. This sulcus what we call posterior lateral sulcus. Then in the anterior part, this sulcus what we call anterolateral sulcus. Then in the anterior most part here, it shows an indentation like fissure. This fissure what we call anterior median fissure. This is anterior median fissure, this is posterior median sulcus, this is posterolateral sulcus, this is anterolateral sulcus. This is the outline. Then if you observe in the central part, you can see the grey matter. This grey matter is like wings of butterfly, otherwise H-shaped. And in the center of the grey matter, you can see the canal here. This canal what we call central canal. So the central part is grey matter and peripheral part is white matter. This white matter further divided into anterior part, anterior white funiculus, lateral part, lateral white funiculus, and the posterior part, posterior white funiculus. Because of this sulcus and this posterior median septum, here septum will be there, posterior median septum. Because of the posterior median septum and because of the anterior median fissure, spinal cord will be divided into two halves, right and left halves. Then this is anterior white funiculus, this is lateral white funiculus, this is posterior white funiculus. This anterior white funiculus of both sides will be united here or communicated here. This communication what we call anterior white commissure. Then if you observe in the grey matter also, anterior to the central canal, posterior to the central canal, this half of the grey matter, this half of the grey matter communicated with each other. Because of that they given the name this part and this part what we call anterior and posterior grey commissure respectively. Anterior grey commissure, posterior grey commissure. So this is the transverse section of spinal cord in brief. I am not going in detail, but if you observe, this is a posterior horn, this is anterior horn. But in case of thoracic region, you can see one more horn, that means one more lateral projection you can see. This lateral projection what we call lateral horn. In case of thoracic region and upper two lumbar segments, you can see the lateral projections also. These lateral projections what we call lateral horn. Now what is present in the anterior horn, what is present in the posterior horn, that we will see. In the posterior horn, all sensory neurons are present. That means neurons which are taking the sensory information, those neurons are located in the posterior horn. In case of anterior horn, motor neurons are present. The neurons which are taking the motor information, those neurons are located here. Those neurons arranged in the mass of grey matter. For those masses we have given some names. What are those names? Part of the grey matter which is present along the posterior end of the posterior horn. This mass of grey matter what we call marginal nucleus. What is this called? Marginal nucleus. Next to the marginal nucleus you can see one more mass of grey matter here. This mass of grey matter what we call substantia gelatinosa. What is this? Substantia gelatinosa. So I am drawing like it is crying. Why it is crying? Because substantia gelatinosa is taking the pain and temperature impulses. Next to that you can find another nucleus. This nucleus is nucleus proprius. Anatomically what we call nucleus proprius, but physiologically what we call chief nucleus. This nucleus is chief nucleus. Nucleus proprius, or we can also call as chief nucleus. Next to this, that means in front of the chief nucleus you can find other nucleus. This nucleus what we call dorsal nucleus of Clark or dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. Dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. So these are the different nuclei which are present in the posterior horn. What is this? Marginal nucleus. What is this? Substantia gelatinosa. What is this? Nucleus proprius or chief nucleus. And what is this? Dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. Then if you observe here, you can see the nucleus. This nucleus what we call intermediate lateral nucleus. This is what we call intermediate lateral nucleus. Then if we coming to the anterior part, here there will be anterior horn cells will be present. Anterior horn cells are three types are there. Alpha cells, there will be so many alpha cells. Then there will be gamma cells and there will be Rensa cells. There will be Rensa cells. So in the anterior horn there will be three types of cells are present: alpha cells, gamma cells and Rensa cells. These are the different nuclei which are present in the anterior horn. At the same time we will try to draw the rigid lamina here. This grey matter of the spinal cord has been divided into 10 laminae. Those laminae what we call rigid laminae. Let me compare those laminae with these nucleus. This is the marginal nucleus. Here this is the laminae 1. Marginal nucleus is equal to laminae 1. Then substantia gelatinosa. This is substantia gelatinosa. This substantia gelatinosa is equal to laminae 2, laminae 3. Substantia gelatinosa is equal to laminae 2 and laminae 3. Laminae 2 and 3 is equal to substantia gelatinosa. Then laminae 3, laminae 4 and laminae 5 is equal to nucleus proprius or chief nucleus. Then laminae 6 is equal to dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. So posterior horn contains 1 to 6 laminae. Those are equal to marginal nucleus, substantia gelatinosa, nucleus proprius and dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. Recollect once again, lamina 1 is equal to marginal nucleus, lamina 2 and 3 is equal to substantia gelatinosa, lamina 3, lamina 4, lamina 5 is equal to nucleus proprius and lamina 6 is equal to dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. Then what about this nucleus? Intermediate lateral nucleus. So this intermediate lateral nucleus is equal to lamina 7. Then the medial part of the anterior horn is equal to lamina 8. Then lateral part lamina 9, surrounding the central canal lamina 10. So this is about the grey matter in brief. Then if you see the white matter, through this white matter only tracts are ascending and descending. Some tracts are ascending and descending through the anterior white funiculus, some tracts are ascending and descending through the lateral white funiculus, and some tracts are ascending, only ascending through the posterior white funiculus. This is about the transverse section of spinal cord in brief. Now we will discuss about the tracts, ascending tracts. See here, ascending tracts are different types are there. We will discuss one by one. First, if you take anterior spinothalamic tract, spinothalamic tract. Second one is lateral spinothalamic tract. Third one is anterior or ventral spinocerebellar tract, spinocerebellar tract. Fourth one is dorsal posterior spinocerebellar tract. Then in relation with the anterior spinocerebellar tract, we will discuss one more tract because these are almost similar. Those are spinotectal tract, spinotectal tract. Then if you come into the next one, Fasciculus gracilis and Fasciculus Cuneatus. These are the important tracts. Other tracts also we will discuss, but we mainly concentrate on these tracts: anterior spinothalamic tract, lateral spinothalamic tract and anterior spinocerebellar tract, dorsal spinocerebellar tract, Fasciculus gracilis, Fasciculus Cuneatus. Before that, we should know these tracts are carrying which impulses. See here, anterior spinothalamic tract is taking the crude touch, that means pressure sensation is carried by the anterior spinothalamic tract. Lateral spinothalamic tract is taking the pain sensation. Anterior spinocerebellar tract and the dorsal spinocerebellar tracts, these are taking the unconscious proprioceptive sensation, that means unconscious kinesthetic sensation is carried by anterior spinocerebellar tract and dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Then Fasciculus gracilis, Fasciculus Cuneatus carrying the impulses of tactile sensation, that means fine touch, tactile discrimination, conscious kinesthetic sensation, stereognosis. So these sensations will be carried by the Fasciculus gracilis and Fasciculus Cuneatus. Clear? So now we will start discussing about the anterior spinothalamic tract. Right? So here I am drawing the same diagram. For continuation, I am drawing the same diagram here. So this is the brain, midbrain, pons, and here medulla oblongata, and here this is the spinal cord. I am drawing spinal cord improportionally larger because we need to draw some cut section also here. So this is the spinal cord, and if you observe here, you can see the one ventricle here. What is this ventricle? Third ventricle. On either side of the third ventricle, you can find the mass of grey matter called thalamus. So that this will be the midline. This is the midline. Now I am taking the section of spinal cord here. So if you take the section of spinal cord, posterior median septum, anterior median fissure, this is grey matter, and here is the central canal. This is one section, and I will take one more section here. Here we have taken the two sections, right? Now we will discuss these two tracts together, anterior spinothalamic tract and lateral spinothalamic tract. So anterior spinothalamic tract is carrying which sensation? Pressure sensation. So here pressure receptor should be there from the body, that means within the skin or within the different parts of the body should have some pressure receptors. What are the pressure receptors here? There will be pressure receptors called Pacinian corpuscles. What are those? There will be receptors like these. These receptors what we call Pacinian corpuscles. Pacinian corpuscles. When you apply pressure over the any part of our body, these receptors will be stimulated. Once these receptors are stimulated, this information has to go to the cerebrum. How it will go? See here. Once these receptors are stimulated, these are transducers. Transducers means what? They convert the mechanical impulses to the electrical impulses. Right? Once they converted the electrical impulses, those electrical impulses will be carried by the nerve fibers. Right? See here. In the posterior root of spinal cord, you can see the one ganglion. What is that ganglion? Dorsal root ganglion. See here. This is the anterior root. It is arising from the anterior horn cells. This is posterior root. In the posterior root, you can see the dilatation here. This dilatation, what we call spinal ganglion or dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion. After that, this posterior root and anterior root united and forms the spinal nerve. This spinal nerve further divided into posterior primary rami and anterior primary rami. Within the dorsal root ganglion or posterior root ganglion, you can see some cells. Those are unipolar cells, otherwise pseudo unipolar cells. Why we are calling these cells are pseudo unipolar? Actually, those cells are larger cells and they gives one process. Because of that, they are unipolar cells. But this process, after going some distance, it will be divided into two processes. One process is going to the central nervous system, another process is going to the periphery. Because of that, these cells, what we call pseudo unipolar cells. They are looking like unipolar, but they are not. Once they reach some distance, they will be divided into two processes. This process is peripheral process and this process is central process. So this type of neurons are present here. Let me draw that neuron here. So this is the pseudo unipolar cell and it is giving two processes. No, this is peripheral process. It may pass either through the anterior primary rami or the posterior primary rami. See, posterior root is purely sensory, anterior root is purely motor, but the spinal nerve is mixed. So it may pass through this primary rami or it may pass through this primary rami. If it is passing through this primary rami, it is supplying to the posterior part of the body. But if it is passing through the anterior primary rami, it will be supplying to the anterolateral part of the body and also limbs. So for suppose it is passing through the anterior primary rami and it reaches here and it terminates over the pressure receptor. Since we are discussing about the pressure sensation, it is ending over the pressure receptor. This pressure receptor has been already stimulated. So this pressure sensation will be converted into the electrical stimulation by these receptors and the same impulses will be passing through the peripheral process of pseudo unipolar cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. Then from here central process will be arising. No, that means this pressure information or pressure sensation is carried by peripheral process of pseudo unipolar cells and this sensation reaching the cell, from the cell through the central process, this sensation is reaching to the posterior horn cells. It is reaching the posterior horn. In the posterior horn cells are there. So it is reaching the nucleus proprius or chief nucleus. That means pressure sensations will be reaching the nucleus proprius. Here nucleus proprius or chief nucleus. So this is the first order neuron. That means first neuron which is taking the sensation. So this neuron what we call first order neuron. Now second order neurons are arising from nucleus proprius or chief nucleus. Right? Nucleus means what? Mass of grey matter. Mass of grey matter means what? Cell bodies are present here. So those cell bodies are giving process. No, those processes are the axons crossing the, that means the process which is present here, it is crossing the midline and reaching the anterior white funiculus of opposite half of the spinal cord. Then in the opposite half of the spinal cord it ascends up. So it ascends up in the spinal cord, it ascends up through the, what is this part? Medulla oblongata, and it ascends up through the pons and it ascends up through the midbrain Then it reaches to the thalamus and it will be terminated. This is what? Second order neuron. Second order neuron is arising from the nucleus proprius. Fibers from that nucleus has been crossed the midline and reaching the anterior white funiculus of opposite half of the spinal cord. Then it ascends upwards in the anterior white funiculus of opposite half of the spinal cord. Then it ascends upward through the brainstem and reaching the thalamus. In the thalamus, VPL, ventral posterior lateral nucleus. It reaches to the VPL nucleus. From there, third order neurons will be arising. Those third order neurons are reaching to the area number 312, synesthetic sensory area. Actually, it is present in the post-central gyrus. This is how pressure sensation is reaching the cerebrum. Very simple. When you apply pressure over the body, pressure receptors are stimulated, converts the mechanical impulses into the electrical impulses. That impulses will be giving to the peripheral process of cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. Then central process of these cells will be reaching the nucleus proprius or chief nucleus. So this is first order neuron. Then second order neuron is arising from the nucleus proprius. Axons of those cells will be crossing the midline and reaching the opposite half of the anterior white funiculus. Then in the anterior white funiculus of opposite half of the spinal cord, these fibers ascends up, pass through the brainstem and pass through the internal capsule and they reaches to the thalamus, where ventral posterior lateral nucleus. From this nucleus, third order neurons are started and reaching to the area number 312. That means synesthetic sensory area. So this is how pressure sensation will be carried. Then coming to the next one, lateral spinothalamic tract. Since we know one tract, this tract is very easy. Only few things will change. What are those? Receptor will change, nucleus will change and the white funiculus will change. That means where bundle is ascending, that will change. Remaining will be same. First order neuron, second order neuron, third order neuron and the course will be similar. So when you take the lateral spinothalamic tract, first we should know the receptor. For the pain, you can see the receptor called free nerve endings. Free nerve endings. These are the cells and this is the free nerve ending. So for the pain, what is the receptor? Free nerve endings. Then lateral spinothalamic tract is not only carrying the pain sensation, it is carrying the temperature sensation also. For the temperature, what are the receptors? There are two receptors. One is for the warm, another is for the cold. If you take the cold receptor, this is the receptor which is taking the cold sensation. This receptor, what we call Crassus receptor. Crassus receptor. This is for the cold. What about the warm? For the warm, there will be Ruffini's end organs. There will be Ruffini's end organs like this. Either it is pain, either it is cold, or either it is hot or warm. When these receptors are stimulated, that mechanical stimulus will be converted into the electrical stimulus. That electrical stimulus will be carried by the same neurons. That means first order neurons which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. Let me draw that. This is the posterior root. This is anterior root. In the posterior root, showing the dilatation. Then here, this is spinal nerve. If this is the pain, first order neurons will be passing through either anterior primary rami or posterior primary rami. They enters into the spinal nerve and here they reaches to the dorsal root ganglion. This dorsal root ganglion having the cell body having the peripheral process and central process. First sensation has come through the peripheral process reaching the cell, then the same sensation is passing through the central process and reaching the dorsal horn cells. So what are the dorsal horn cells here? See, lateral spinothalamic tract, second order neurons are arising from the marginal nucleus and substantia gelatinosa. Marginal nucleus and substantia gelatinosa. So here it is relaying in two nuclei. Then second order neurons. Second order neurons will be arising from the marginal nucleus and substantia gelatinosa. Actually, this nucleus what we call substantia gelatinosa of Rolando, right? So here second order neurons are started. These second order neurons, once they arising from there, they cross to the opposite side. They cross to the opposite side and they reaches to the lateral white funiculus. They reaches to lateral white funiculus. Within the lateral white funiculus, they ascends up. They ascends throughout the spinal cord and they pass through the brainstem and they reaches to the VPL, ventral posterior lateral nucleus of thalamus. From there, third order neurons will start. These third order neurons are reaching the area number 312. So, if you compare with this, what changes we have found? Receptors are changed. If the crisis receptors are stimulated, cold stimulation is going. If roughness end organs are stimulated, hot stimulation is going. If free nerve endings are stimulated, pain impulses are going. So, through the peripheral process of dorsal root ganglion, these sensations will be carried reaching the cell body. From the cell body, same sensation will be carried by the central process. Those central processes will be reaching the posterior horn cells. What are those? Substantia gelatinosa and marginal nuclei. From there, second order neurons are started. Those second order neurons are crossing from this side to this side. If it is coming from that side, they will be crossing from this side to this side. They crosses to the opposite side and reaching the lateral white funiculus. Within the lateral white funiculus, these fibers are ascending up, pass through the spinal cord, pass through the brainstem, pass through the internal capsule and reaching the thalamus. Within the thalamus, third order neurons are started and reaching to the area number 312. That means somesthetic sensory area. That's it about the pain pathway. Let me repeat it. It is very simple. In case of pain, free nerve endings will stimulate. In case of cold, crisis receptors will stimulate. In case of warm, roughness end organs will stimulate. That stimulus will be converted into electrical impulses. Those impulses will be carried by the peripheral process of cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion and reaches to the cell bodies. From the cell bodies, same stimulus will be carried by central process. Those central processes will be reaching to the substantia gelatinosa and the marginal nucleus. Then second order neurons from those nuclei, that means from the substantia gelatinosa of Rolando and marginal nuclei. From those nuclei, second order neurons will start. Those second order neurons will crosses the midline and reaches to the opposite side, lateral white funiculus. Then within the lateral white funiculus of opposite side, fibers will ascend. That means second order neurons will ascends up, passes through the brainstem and internal capsule and they reaches to the thalamus. In the thalamus, they relay in the ventral posterior lateral nucleus. Then from the thalamus, third order neurons, these are the third order neurons. Third order neurons will start. Those third order neurons will be reaching to the area number 312. So, what is the difference between the anterior spinothalamic tract and lateral spinothalamic tract? In case of anterior spinothalamic tract, receptors are pressure receptors. That means Pacinian corpuscles. In case of lateral spinothalamic tract, there are three receptors. If it is pain, free nerve endings. If it is cold, crosses receptors. If it is hot or warmth, roughness end organs. Then first order neurons, same. That means cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. Then second order neurons. In case of anterior spinothalamic tract, second order neurons will start from the nucleus proprius. In case of lateral spinothalamic tract, second order neurons will start from the marginal nucleus and substantia gelatinosa. In case of anterior spinothalamic tract, this tract will ascend through the anterior white funiculus. But in case of lateral spinothalamic tract, as name implies, these fibers will be running in the lateral white funiculus. Then they pass through the spinal cord, pass through the brainstem and pass through the internal capsule and they reaches to the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus. Then third order neurons will start from the same nuclei and they reaches to the area number 312. Here one important thing you should remember, when they are passing through the brainstem, here one network of fibers and cells will be there. This network of fibers and cells which are present in the brainstem, what you call reticular formation. So here reticular formation is there. Some fibers from the anterior spinothalamic tract and some fibers from the lateral spinothalamic tract connect with the reticular formation. That means some fibers from the anterior spinothalamic tract and lateral spinothalamic tract will connect with the reticular formation. Because of that only, whenever the person is in the coma, they will give the pain stimulus to wake up. So this is about the anterior spinothalamic tract and lateral spinothalamic tract. Now we will discuss about anterior or ventral spinocerebellar tract, dorsal or posterior spinocerebellar tract. For that same diagram I will take here. This is cerebrum, this is midbrain, here is pons, here medulla oblongata, here spinal cord. It is schematic view. Here you can see the third ventricle and thalamus. Actually for these two tracts no need of drawing thalamus and third ventricle, but for continuation purpose I am drawing. Here is thalamus. Here is the midline. This is midline. It divides right and left halves. Behind the pons and medulla oblongata you can find small brain. What is that structure? Cerebellum. Here I am drawing cerebellum. Behind the pons and medulla oblongata you can find the cerebellum. See here, this is the midbrain, this is the pons, this is the medulla oblongata. From midbrain to cerebellum there will be one connection. That connection what you call superior cerebellar peduncle. From pons to cerebellum there is one more connection. This connection or this communication what we call middle cerebellar peduncle, both sides. This is superior cerebellar peduncle and this is the middle cerebellar peduncle. Then what is left here? Medulla oblongata with the cerebellum. There is one more peduncle. This peduncle what we call inferior cerebellar peduncle. This is the midbrain, this is the pons, this is the medulla oblongata. Midbrain connected with the cerebellum, superior cerebellar peduncle. Pons connected with the cerebellum with the middle cerebellar peduncle. Medulla oblongata connected with the cerebellum by inferior cerebellar peduncle. In the same manner, we will take two sections here. See here, anterior spinocerebellar tract takes the sensation from joints and muscles. So, what are the receptors which are present in the joints and muscles? In tendons, you can find the Golgi tendon apparatus. In muscles, you can find the muscle spindle and some stretch receptors and pain receptors which are present in the joint. For suppose, this is the muscle spindle. So, this is the receptor, proprioceptive receptor. Once if it is stimulated, see here, it contains nerve fibers. Now it has been stimulated. Once it is stimulated, this sensation has to be carried to the cerebellum, because cerebellum is always updating our position, in which position we are and in which position our joints are, in which state our muscles are there. Now either muscle spindle or the Golgi tendon apparatus, it has been stimulated now. That will be converted into electrical impulses. That impulses will be carried by the cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. So here we have to draw again same structure. What is that? Dorsal root, and it shows elevation here. This elevation what we call dorsal root ganglion. Then here is anterior root. This is anterior root. Both anterior root and posterior root are united and forms the spinal nerve. Then it will be divided into posterior primary rami and anterior primary rami. Within the dorsal root ganglion, you can find the first order neurons. So what are these? These are the pseudo unipolar cells, right? If they are pseudo unipolar cells, they will be having the two processes. One process coming towards the periphery. This process what we call peripheral process. Another process entering into the central nervous system. That means it is entering into the posterior horn of the spinal cord. So these receptors has been stimulated. Stimulus will be converted into the electrical impulses. That impulses will be passing through the peripheral process of dorsal root ganglionic cells. Then same sensation will be carried through the central process and they reaches to the marginal nucleus. Within the marginal nucleus, second order neurons are there. Now second order neurons from the marginal nucleus crosses the midline, reaches to the opposite side and they ascends upward in the lateral white funiculus. They ascends through the medulla oblongata, pons, and they reaches to the superior cerebellar peduncle. Once they reaches to the superior cerebellar peduncle, through the superior cerebellar peduncle, they reaches to the opposite side cerebellum. Most of the textbooks they gives that once they reaches to the opposite side cerebellum, again they reaches to the same side, because cerebellum is controlling the ipsilateral half of the body, but cerebrum is controlling the contralateral half of the body. Cerebellum is controlling the ipsilateral, so that this tract also reaching to the same side cerebellar hemisphere. This is about the anterior spinocerebellar tract. Very simple. Proprioceptive receptors will stimulate. That stimulus will be converted into the electrical impulses. That electrical impulses will be carried by the peripheral process of cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. Then same impulses will be carried by the central processes and reaching to the marginal nucleus of posterior horn. This is the first order neuron. Second order neuron will start in the marginal nucleus. Fibers of those neurons will crosses to the opposite side and ascends upwards. When they reaches to the level of superior cerebellar peduncle, they pass through the superior cerebellar peduncle, reaches to the opposite side cerebellar hemisphere. From there again they reaches to the same side cerebellar hemisphere, because cerebellum is controlling the ipsilateral half of the body, not contralateral. But if you take the cerebrum, it is controlling the contralateral half of the body. So this is about the anterior spinocerebellar tract. As we discussed earlier, spinotectal tract is similar to the anterior spinocerebellar tract except little modification. Let me tell you. Same receptors will be stimulated, impulses will be passing through the peripheral process, reaching to the dorsal root ganglion, then through the central process, reaching to the marginal nucleus. From the marginal nucleus, second order neurons will start. Those will crosses to the opposite side. They ascend upwards and reaches to the midbrain. Within the midbrain, you can see two colliculus, superiorly and inferiorly. So what are these colliculi? Superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. Now these fibers, so these fibers are crossing to the opposite side, then ascends upwards and they reaches to the superior colliculus. This is only spinotectal tract. In case of anterior spinocerebellar tract, it reaches to the cerebellum. In case of spinotectal, second order neurons will be reaching to the superior colliculus. This tract is responsible for the visual reflex. So this is about the anterior spinocerebellar tract and spinotectal tract. Then dorsal spinocerebellar tract. See, in case of dorsal spinocerebellar tract also, receptors are same. So these are only receptors. We have to draw the same structure, posterior root. So here you can see the dorsal root ganglion, here anterior root, anterior and posterior primary rami. Here first order neurons are present here. This is the pseudo unipolar cell. It is having the two processes, no? One is the peripheral process. It comes like this and terminated over the receptors. So this stimulus will be carried by the peripheral processes. Then from the peripheral process, they reaches to the cell body. From the cell body through the central process, this proprioceptive information reaching to the dorsal horn cells. Which nucleus is remaining now? Marginal over, substantia gelatinosa over, nucleus proprius over, left with only this one, dorsal nucleus of Clarkis or Clarkis nucleus. So here they relay in the Clarkis nucleus. I am putting C here. They relay in the Clarkis nucleus. From the Clarkis nucleus, second order neurons will start. These second order neurons will not cross as the midline. They reaches to the same side lateral white funiculus and they ascends up. They ascends up like this in the lateral white funiculus. When they reaches to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, they pass through the inferior cerebellar peduncle and reaches to the same side cerebellar hemisphere. This is the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Very simple. Receptors are same and the first order neuron is same. Relay nucleus is dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. Second order neurons arising from the dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. Then they ascend upwards in the same side. When they reaches to the inferior cerebellar peduncle, they pass through the inferior cerebellar peduncle and reaches to the same side cerebellar hemisphere. That's it about the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Anterior and dorsal spinocerebellar tract, they carries the unconscious kinesthetic sensation. Unconsciously, our position sense will be taking by this two tract and giving to the cerebellum. Even though we are not aware, our position is always updating. Position of our body, position of the joints, state of muscles will be updated in the cerebellum by these tracts. So these are ventral and dorsal spinocerebellar tracts. They carries the unconscious kinesthetic sensation. So this is about the anterior spinocerebellar tract and the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Now what we left with? Fasciculus gracilis and Fasciculus Cuneatus. For that we require some space. That's what I am removing this half. So finally we have to discuss about the Fasciculus gracilis, Fasciculus Cuneatus. Together we will discuss. Right? That tract we can also call as tract of Gall and tract of Burdock. Tract of gall and tract of Burdock. We will take the same picture here. So here I am taking the cerebral hemisphere. We have drawn the schematic view of brain and spinal cord. Now we will draw the same structures here. First order neuron will be present in the dorsal spinal ganglion or posterior root ganglion. So this is the dorsal root ganglion and here is anterior root. These two roots are united and forms the spinal nerve. That spinal nerve will be divided into posterior primary rami and anterior primary rami. Here also same. Now we should know these two tracts, that means Fasciculus Gracilis, Fasciculus Cuneatus, carrying which sensation? Fine touch, tactile discrimination, tactile localization, conscious kinesthetic sensation, proprioception. These sensations will be carried by the posterior column fibers. That means fibers which are present in the posterior white funiculus. So for the fine touch, what are the receptors? Merkel's discs, they will be like this. These are Merkel's discs. Meissner's corpuscles, they will be like this. For the touch, these two are the receptors. For the proprioception, we know that there will be muscle spindle, Golgi tendon apparatus and other receptors which are present over the joints. So if these receptors are stimulated, that stimulus will be converted into the electrical impulses. That electrical impulses will be carried by the first order neurons which are present in the posterior root ganglion or dorsal root ganglion. So here peripheral processes are there. Touch receptors, proprioceptor receptors are stimulated. That stimulus will be converted into the electrical impulses. That electrical impulses will be carried through the peripheral processes of pseudo unipolar cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. Then same impulses will be passing through the central process and they reaches to the posterior horn of spinal cord. This tract is Fasciculus Cuneatus because it is taking the sensations from the upper part of the body and upper limbs. And if you take the other one, Fasciculus Gracilis, receptors are same and the process is also same. Peripheral processes of dorsal root ganglionic cells. From here central process will be arising. This central process will be passing through the dorsal root and they reaches to the posterior horn. For these two tracts, first order neurons are present in the dorsal root ganglion. For remaining all tracts, second order neurons are present in the posterior horn. But here marginal nucleus engaged, substantia gelatinosa already engaged, nucleus proprius engaged, dorsal nucleus of clock engaged. Because of that, this central processes of first order neuron itself ascends upward in the posterior white matter. They ascends upward in the posterior white funiculus. Then here same. They reaches here, they couldn't found any nucleus. Then they ascends upward in the posterior white funiculus. They ascends upward like this. Then they are reaching to the medulla oblongata. They reaches to medulla oblongata. You must be studied in the posterior part of the medulla oblongata. You can see the two elevations, gracile tubercle and cuneate tubercle. Deep to the gracile tubercle and cuneate tubercle, you can find the two nuclei. Those nuclei what we call gracile nucleus and cuneate nucleus. So here you can see the nucleus. This nucleus what we call gracile nucleus. Here you can find the one more nucleus. This nucleus what we call cuneate nucleus. This is gracile nucleus, this is cuneate nucleus. Within the gracile nucleus, first order neurons will be terminated or relayed. Within the cuneate nucleus, first order neurons are relayed or terminated. Now from here, second order neurons will start where within the medulla oblongata. But in case of remaining tracts, second order neurons are present in the spinal cord level itself. But in case of dorsal column fibers or Fasciculus Gracilis, Fasciculus Cuneatus, first order neurons only ascends upward till medulla oblongata. When they reaches to the medulla oblongata, they found the nucleus. Medially gracile nucleus, laterally cuneate nucleus. Now the second order neurons are started. These second order neurons, they have seen all the tracts. All the tracts are crossed and they think that why don't we? Then they crossed. So they crossed to the opposite side as internal arcade fibers. They crosses to the opposite side as internal arcade fibers. Then they ascends up as medial lemniscus. In case of these two tracts, anterior spinothalamic tract and lateral spinothalamic tract, when they are passing through the brainstem, this bundle what we call spinal lemniscus. And here internal arcade fibers, after crossing the midline, when they are ascending up in the brainstem, this bundle what we call medial lemniscus. Medial lemniscus. Now they ascends up and they reaches to the same nucleus of thalamus. What is that nucleus? Ventral, posterior, lateral nucleus. From here, third order neurons will start. Third order neurons from here, they reaches to the area number 312. So here they reaches to the area number 312, somatic sensory area. If you observe in the opposite side also, here also gracile nucleus and here also cuneate nucleus. Second order neurons from this nucleus, they crosses like this and they ascends upward and they reaches here. What has happened here? There is decussation of sensory fibers. This decussation what we call sensory decussation. This decussation what we call sensory decussation. So this is about the dorsal column fibers. Otherwise Fasciculus Gracilis, Fasciculus Cuneatus. Otherwise tract of gall and tract of burdock. So let me repeat it. Receptors of fine touch, receptors of proprioception, receptors of kinesthetic sensation will be stimulated. That stimulus will be converted into the electrical impulses. Those impulses will be carried by the first order neurons which are present in the dorsal root ganglion, and central process of those neurons will be reaching to the posterior horn. They couldn't found any nucleus. All nuclei are engaged with those tracts. Then they ascends upward. That means first order neurons itself they ascends upward. This medial part is Fasciculus Gracilis and the lateral part is Fasciculus Cuneatus. In this area, these tracts will ascends up and they reaches to the medulla oblongata. Within the medulla oblongata, they have found gracile nucleus, cuneate nucleus. Within the gracile nucleus, Fasciculus Gracilis will terminate. Within the cuneate nucleus, Fasciculus Cuneatus will terminate. Then second order neurons will arise. Those second order neurons what we call internal arcade fibers. Those internal arcade fibers will crosses from one side to another side. Okay, they crosses the midline and they ascends upward as medial lemniscus and they reaches to the thalamus and terminates. That means second order neurons will terminate and third order neurons will start in the thalamus. They reaches to the area number 312. So here first order neurons. So this is only about the ascending tracts. Some other small tracts are there like Spinoreticular Tract. Second order neurons from the spinal cord, they reaches to the reticular formation. So that is what we call Spinoreticular. Spinotectal I have already told. Spino-Olivary from the spinal cord to the olivary nucleus. Right? But importantly you should know anterior and lateral spinothalamic tract, ventral and dorsal spinocerebellar tract, Fasciculus Gracilis, Fasciculus Cuneatus. Now I will brief out all the tracts. Anterior spinothalamic tract carries the pressure sensation. Pacinian corpuscle cells will stimulate. That impulse will be carried by the peripheral process of cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion and they reaches to the cell body. From the cell body, same impulses will be carried by the central process and they reaches to the nuclei which are present in the dorsal horn. Here for anterior spinothalamic tract, second order neurons will start in the nucleus proprius. Now second order neurons which are present in the nucleus proprius, they crosses the midline and they reaches to the anterior white funiculus of opposite side. Then they ascends upward through the spinal cord and brainstem and reaches to the thalamus. Within the thalamus, they relay in the ventral, posterior, lateral nucleus. Within that nucleus, third order neurons will start. Those third order neurons will be reaching to the area number 312. That is somatic sensory area or sensory area of the cerebrum. Clear? So this is the anterior spinothalamic tract. Then lateral spinothalamic tract. It is carried pain sensation, receptors are free nerve endings. Cold sensation, receptors are crosses receptors. Warm sensation or hot sensation, receptors are roughness end organs. When these receptors are stimulated, that stimulus will be converted into electrical impulses. Those impulses will be carried by the peripheral processes of dorsal root ganglion. They carry those sensations, they reaches to the cells which are present in the dorsal root ganglion. Then from there, central processes will be passing through the posterior root and reaching to the dorsal nuclei. Since these are the touch and pain, they will be relaying in the marginal nucleus and substantia gelatinosa of Rolando. So this nucleus is marginal nucleus and substantia gelatinosa of Rolando. From here second order neurons will start. Those second order neurons will be crossing the midline and reaching the lateral white funiculus of opposite side. Then they ascends upward. When they are passing through the brainstem, anterior spinothalamic tract and lateral spinothalamic tract, together what we call spinal lemniscus. Then they ascend upward and reaches to the thalamus, ventral posterior lateral nucleus of thalamus. There third order neurons will start. Those third order neurons will be reaching to the area number 312. That means they reaches to the somatic sensory area. When these two tracts are passing through the brainstem, they will be connected with the reticular formation. Of course, almost all tracts will be connected with the reticular formation. Clear? Then anterior spinocerebellar, posterior spinocerebellar, because they are taking the unconscious kinesthetic sensation. So those receptors like muscle spindle and Golgi tendon apparatus and other receptors which are present over the joints. When those receptors are stimulated, first order neurons are taking those impulses and they reaches to the dorsal root ganglion. From there, central process will be taking the same sensation and they reaching to the posterior horn nuclei. In case of anterior spinocerebellar tract, second order neurons will start in the marginal nucleus. But in case of dorsal spinocerebellar tract, second order neurons will start in the dorsal nucleus of Clarkis. Right? Up to this course is same. But second order neurons in case of anterior spinocerebellar tract, they crosses to the opposite side, ascends upward in the lateral weight funiculus of opposite side. Then they ascends upward. When they reaches to the superior cerebellar peduncle, they reaches to the opposite side cerebellar hemisphere. After that, they realize that it is not their final destination. They crosses to the same side. Then, if we coming to the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, second order neurons will not cross. They ascends upward in the lateral weight funiculus of same side. Then they ascends upward and reaches to the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, they terminate in the same side cerebellum.